47 seconds. That was how long Cadet Instructor Valen said the average engagement lasted before one craft or the other ceased to exist as a functional object. He told us this during our 3rd week at the training facility on Cyprus Secundus. I remember. No. I archived the number. The distinction matters now, though it did not then. 47 seconds. I have since participated in 219 recorded engagements. The average holds. Valen died in week 9 when his training craft's reactor shielding failed during a live-fire exercise. The number outlived him. The number outlives everyone. I was 17 standard years when they pulled me from the Schola Progenium. My parents had served in the Navy, both lost when their transport was destroyed during a supply run I have no details about. The administrator logged me as suitable candidate material based on aptitude scores I do not remember taking. There was a room, white walls, a proctor who did not speak, a series of tests involving spatial recognition, reaction timing, and something they called situational resolution under pressure. I completed them. 2 weeks later, I received notification of my reassignment to Fighter Training Command. There was no option to decline. I observed later that none of us had been given that option. We simply arrived, were processed, and began. The facility on Cyprus Secundus occupied the interior of a hollowed asteroid. They had carved out the rock centuries before and installed centrifuge rings for gravity training, vacuum chambers for suit conditioning, and simulation pods that ran for 18 hours per cycle. We slept in shifts. The bunks were stacked 4 high in compartments that held 60 of us. I remember the smell. Recycled air, human sweat, the particular staleness that comes from too many bodies in too small a space, with inadequate scrubbing systems. The temperature stayed constant at 18 degrees. Cold enough that we never quite warmed up, warm enough that we did not require additional thermal layers. Efficient. Everything was efficient. There were 143 of us in the intake group. We lost 11 in the first month. Not to training accidents, those came later, but to psychological washout. The instructors called it operational incompatibility. One candidate began screaming during a sensory deprivation test and did not stop for 6 hours. They removed him. Another simply stopped responding to commands. He would sit in the briefing hall, staring forward, but when called upon he produced no reaction. They removed him too. I never learned where they went. The bunks were reassigned the same cycle. They began vacuum exposure in week 2. Small chambers, barely large enough to stand in. They would seal you inside, reduce the pressure gradually, and time how long you maintained consciousness. The suits we wore were basic models. No augmentation, minimal thermal regulation. The first time, I lasted 4 minutes and 12 seconds before the hypoxia triggered involuntary shutdown. I came to in the medical bay, with blood vessels burst across my eyes, and a taste like copper filling my mouth. The medici on duty logged the result and told me the next session was in 16 hours. I asked what the acceptable threshold was. He said there was no acceptable threshold, only improvement. By week 8, I could maintain function for 11 minutes. Others lasted longer. Herrick, a tall candidate from a mining world I cannot recall the name of, managed 14. He had grown up in reduced atmosphere environments. His physiology adapted better. I noted this. Competition was not encouraged, but comparison was inevitable. We were being measured against a standard we could not see, evaluated for a role that had not been fully explained. The training continued. We adapted, or we were removed. Valen had been a combat pilot. 16 years of service, 73 confirmed kills, multiple campaigns I did not recognize the names of. He walked with a limp from a crash landing that had shattered his left leg in 4 places. The augmetic replacement functioned adequately, but the gait remained. He told us about the 47 seconds during a briefing on engagement geometry. He was explaining why we would learn to fire, maneuver, and assess simultaneously. Because there was no time for sequential processing. You saw the target, calculated intercept, fired, and adjusted before their rounds reached your position. If you processed those steps individually, you exceeded the average engagement duration. You died. I watched him diagram the kill cone on the display board. Angular calculations, velocity differentials, the expanding probability field of where an enemy craft could be by the time your rounds crossed the engagement space. He made it seem logical. A series of problems with solutions we could learn. I believed him then. I wanted to believe structure existed in what we were training for. The simulators were ancient machines, cylindrical pods with full haptic feedback, installed decades before any of us had been born. They smelled like oil and old metal and something else I could not identify. Perhaps the accumulated sweat of everyone who had trained in them before. You would climb inside, seal the canopy, and the system would initiate. Darkness first. Then the display would activate, and you were falling through a debris field at speeds the human mind was not designed to process. The first time, I vomited. The pod registered this as a failure condition and terminated the session. I cleaned the interior myself. No one offered assistance. No one mocked. We all failed in similar ways initially. The haptic system replicated G-forces by compressing your body against the pod's restraint system while simultaneously feeding false sensory data through the neural interface. Your brain interpreted this as acceleration. The nausea was real. The disorientation was real. The panic when it came was real. I ran 72 simulation hours before I stopped vomiting. Herrick managed it faster. 60 hours. I noted this as well. They introduced live weapons in week 15. We transferred from simulators to actual training craft. Modified variants of the standard Fury-class interceptor, stripped down and rebuilt for atmospheric use. The first time I sat in an actual cockpit, I understood why the simulators had been so cramped. This was worse. The seat was barely padded. The controls were within arm's reach only because there was no room to extend your arms further. The canopy clearance above my helmet was perhaps 4 centimeters. When I moved my head, I could hear the shell scrape against the interior padding. The instrumentation panels pressed in from both sides. There was space for the pilot, the control systems, and nothing else. Valen walked us through the pre-flight sequence. 87 distinct checks performed in exact order, no exceptions. Fuel pressure, reactor temperature, thruster alignment, cannon feed integrity, shield capacitor charge, life support flow rate, sensor calibration, communications link stability. The list continued. He said we would memorize it. He said we would perform it automatically, without thought. Because in combat, there was no time for thought, only execution. I remember the first launch. The training craft accelerated at 4G sustained. My vision narrowed. The compression suit inflated around my chest and legs, forcing blood back toward my brain. But the pressure remained. I could feel my lungs struggling to expand against it. The targeting display swam in and out of focus. My hands moved across the controls, following the pattern I had drilled in simulation. But every movement felt sluggish, delayed by the time it took for my brain to process and my body to respond. We flew in formations of 3. I was assigned to a group with Herrick and another candidate named Yevon, shorter than both of us. Quiet, from a void-born family who had served on naval vessels for generations. He never spoke unless directly addressed. During briefings, he would sit and listen, and occasionally nod. In the cockpit, his performance was flawless. His maneuvers were precise. His gunnery scores were the highest in our intake. I never saw him make an error. They had us run intercept drills. One craft would play the target, flying evasive patterns through the upper atmosphere. The other two would pursue. The goal was to achieve firing solution and maintain it for 3 seconds. No actual rounds were fired during these drills. The system logged simulated hits. We rotated roles. When I flew target, I learned what it felt like to watch the pursuit craft close distance while you burned fuel trying to break their lock. The panic was different from the simulator. Intellectual knowledge that this was a training exercise did not override the physical response when you saw the firing indicator flash on your threat display. We lost our first candidate to an actual flight accident in week 17, mechanical failure. The control surface actuators on his starboard wing locked at full extension during a high-speed turn. The craft entered an unrecoverable spin. He ejected. The ejection system functioned correctly. The parachute deployed. He impacted the ground at 70 meters per second because he had ejected at too low an altitude, and there was insufficient distance for the parachute to arrest his descent. We watched it happen. The entire flight group was airborne, running pattern drills. I saw the craft start to spin. I saw the canopy blow. I saw the chute deploy. I watched him hit the ground. The impact raised dust. The instructor's voice came across the comm channel and told us to maintain formation and continue the drill. They recovered the body that evening. We attended a brief ceremony in the main hangar. An officer whose name I do not remember said the candidate had served with distinction and his sacrifice would be honored. They did not say what the sacrifice had achieved. We returned to our bunks. His rack was reassigned within the cycle. Harrick spoke to me that night. We were lying in our bunks, the lights dimmed for sleep shift. He said, "Do you think they will tell our families when we die in training?" I considered the question. I did not know if I had family remaining who would care to be notified. I told him I did not know. He was quiet for a time. Then he said, "I suppose it does not matter. We are already recorded as casualties. We simply have not stopped functioning yet." I did not disagree. The training intensified. They introduced zero-gravity combat maneuvers in week 20. We transferred to craft capable of exo-atmospheric flight and ran drills in low orbit. The difference was immediate. In atmosphere, you had friction, drag, aerodynamic surfaces that provided control. In vacuum, you had thrust and momentum and nothing else. Every movement had to be calculated. If you fired your maneuvering jets to rotate, you continued rotating until you fired them again in opposition. If you accelerated, you continued accelerating until you burned in the opposite direction. There was no coasting. There was no slowing down naturally. Action and reaction. Physics without compromise. The G-forces were worse. Atmospheric flight built up speed gradually. In vacuum, you could burn at maximum thrust without air resistance. The training craft could sustain Hg. Human physiology could theoretically survive 8G with compression suits and conditioning. Theoretically. The first time I pulled a full burn evasive maneuver, I grayed out. My vision collapsed to a tunnel, then to a point, then to nothing. I came to 4 seconds later. The craft had traveled 800 meters. If there had been an enemy with firing solution, I would have died unconscious, unaware, simply transitioning from existence to non-existence during those 4 seconds of blank processing. They taught us to fight the gray-out, breathing techniques, muscle tension sequences, compression suit calibration. You learned to sense when the blackout was approaching and ease off the thrust before you lost consciousness. But in combat, easing off meant losing position. It meant giving the enemy the angle. It meant dying differently, but still dying. Yavin never grayed out. His physiology handled the pressure better than the rest of us. I asked him once how he managed it. He said his family had served on warships for 11 generations. Void-born children grew up in high-G environments during ship maneuvers. He had experienced this since birth. He said it was simply what he was accustomed to. I noted the advantage. I noted I would never possess it. We began live-fire exercises in week 28. They issued us training craft equipped with actual weapon systems. Reduced power variants, but functional. The targets were automated drones, running evasive patterns in designated combat zones. The goal was simple: achieve lock, fire, destroy. I scored my first kill on my third engagement. The autocannon rounds traveled at 3,000 meters per second. The drone was maneuvering at 400 meters per second along an irregular vector. I calculated lead time, adjusted for relative velocity, compensated for my own movement, and fired a 2-second burst. 14 rounds. The targeting system logged 11 impacts. The drone broke apart, venting atmosphere. It had been pressurized to simulate a crude target and tumbled out of the engagement zone. I felt nothing. The system logged the kill. I returned to the training facility. Herrick was better at gunnery than I was. His hit rate was approximately 15% higher. Yavin was better than both of us. His hit rate approached 90%. During debriefs, the instructors would analyze his gun camera footage and highlight his technique. He did not lead the target. He anticipated where the target would be and positioned his craft so the target would maneuver into his fire cone. He killed by predicting behavior. The rest of us killed by chasing. In week 31, they introduced us to the actual combat-rated Fury Interceptor, not the training variant. The real one. I walked across the hangar floor toward it and understood immediately that everything before had been preparation for this. The craft was smaller than the trainer, more angular. The armor plating was thicker. The cockpit canopy was a single piece of reinforced crystal, scarred from repeated impacts. The paint was scorched along the fuselage, where heat buildup from sustained burns had oxidized the coating. This was a combat veteran. Someone had flown this craft. Someone had killed in it. Perhaps someone had died in it and been cut free so it could be refurbished and assigned again. The cockpit was tighter than the trainer. I had to compress my shoulders to fit through the entry hatch. The seat was contoured, designed to distribute pressure during high-G maneuvers, but it felt like sitting in a vise. The restraint harness had 11 separate attachment points. I connected each one. The straps tightened automatically until I could barely expand my chest to breathe. The helmet interface clicked into the socket behind my head. The display systems initialized. Information flooded across my vision. Threat indicators, targeting reticle, fuel status, ammunition count, shield integrity, reactor output, velocity vector, spatial orientation relative to planetary mass. I counted 14 separate data streams, all updating in real time. Valen appeared on the comm channel. He said, "You will notice the increased information density. You will learn to pass it without conscious thought. If you think about reading your instruments, you are already dead. Your brain will learn to process peripherally. Trust the training." I ran my first combat-rated flight that cycle. 8G sustained burn. The compression suit inflated so tightly, I thought my ribs would crack. My vision tunneled. I maintained consciousness, barely. When I landed, I could not stand immediately. My legs would not support me. I sat in the cockpit for 6 minutes before I could climb out. Herrick had similar difficulty. Yavin climbed out immediately and walked to the debrief without issue. We lost 3 more candidates between weeks 32 and 37. 1. To spatial disorientation. He became convinced his instruments were malfunctioning and attempted manual navigation. He flew directly into a debris field at combat speed. The craft was destroyed instantly. The second died during a high-G maneuver when his compression suit failed. The pressure differential caused catastrophic internal hemorrhaging. He was dead before he could signal distress. The third ejected successfully after a collision with another training craft, but his ejection trajectory put him on a vector away from the recovery zone. They tracked his beacon for 41 hours as his life support depleted. He died in vacuum, conscious, aware, drifting. They recovered the body 6 days later. I attended all 3 ceremonies. I watched them seal the remains, what remained, into caskets draped with Imperial Navy standards. I listened to officers recite the same phrases about duty and sacrifice and honor. The words stopped meaning anything by the second ceremony. By the third, I simply archived the event and returned to my bunk. There were 79 of us remaining. Graduation occurred in week 40. No ceremony. An officer appeared during morning briefing and read a list of names. 79 names. He said we had completed basic qualification and would receive our operational assignments within the cycle. He said we were now rated combat pilots in the Imperial Navy. He did not congratulate us. He simply read the list, logged our status updates, and departed. I received my assignment 4 hours later. Strike Carrier Undaunted Resolve, 3rd Battle Group, Segmentum Obscurus. Report for embarkation in 18 hours. I was given that long to gather my personal effects. I had none, and transfer to the shuttle bay. Herrick received assignment to the same vessel. Yavin was assigned elsewhere. I never learned where. We did not exchange farewells. We simply packed our kits and left. The Undaunted Resolve was a Dictator-class carrier, 4 kilometers long, carrying a complement of 90 interceptors, 40 bombers, and support craft I was not briefed on. I arrived with 47 other newly graduated pilots and was assigned to Squadron Tertius 7. The squadron commander was Flight Captain Marek, a veteran of 19 years' service. He had a scar across his throat from an emergency tracheotomy performed after his cockpit lost pressure during a boarding defense. His voice had a mechanical rasp. When he briefed us, he spoke slowly, each word clearly enunciated, as if speaking required conscious effort. He said, "You are replacements. The previous pilots assigned to your craft are dead. You will inherit their flight records, their kill counts, and their designations. You are not individuals. You are pilots. You fly until you die or until you become unable to fly. There is no third option." My assigned craft was Fury 7-4. I accessed the flight record. The previous pilot had logged 206 combat sorties and 31 confirmed kills before dying in an engagement 14 days prior. Cause of death: catastrophic reactor breach following sustained fire from enemy interceptor. The pilot had maintained combat maneuvers for 41 seconds after the reactor was compromised, scoring 2 additional kills before the containment failed. The explosion vaporized the cockpit section. No recovery was possible. I performed the pre-flight inspection on Fury 7-4. The armor showed recent repair work along the port side, new plating still unweathered. The reactor had been replaced entirely. The control systems had been recalibrated. The canopy was new. The previous one had presumably been destroyed along with the pilot. I climbed inside. The seat still smelled like someone else. I could not identify the smell. Something organic, human. I performed the 87-step pre-flight sequence. Everything registered functional. I logged ready status. We flew our first combat patrol 6 hours after I boarded. No contact. We simply burned a perimeter pattern around the carrier while it maneuvered through a disputed sector. The patrol lasted 7 hours. My fuel ran low. I returned, refueled, and launched again. 3 patrols per cycle, 21 hours flight time, 3 hours maintenance, equipment check, and mandatory rest. The cycle repeated. I met Herrick in the pilot ready room during a rest period. We did not speak much. He asked how my craft handled. I said it handled adequately. He said his craft, Fury 7-9, had a tendency to drift starboard during high burn maneuvers. He had logged the issue. Maintenance had recalibrated the thrusters. The drift persisted. He said he was compensating manually. I told him to continue logging the issue. He said he would. We sat in silence for a time. Then the alert status changed, and we returned to our craft. First contact came on my 8th day aboard. Enemy raiders, origin unclear, had engaged one of our outlying picket ships. We launched a full squadron response, 18 interceptors. The flight to the engagement zone took 14 minutes at maximum burn. I spent those 14 minutes watching the range counter decrease and trying to control my breathing. The compression suit inflated and deflated with my respiration. I focused on the rhythm. In, out, in, out. The counter reached 0. The combat zone was chaos. I had trained for this. The simulations had prepared me. They had not. Debris everywhere, tumbling in unpredictable vectors. Wrecked fighter hulls venting atmosphere. Explosive decompression creating visual interference, energy signatures blooming across my sensor display, threat indicators screaming. Target locks forming and breaking as craft maneuvered through the debris field at velocities my eyes could not track. Marek's voice came across the command channel. All units engage at will. Watch your firing lanes. Do not hit friendlies. I saw an enemy interceptor. Different design, unknown classification, maneuvering across my forward arc. I established lock. I fired. The autocannon spun up. The recoil shuddered through the entire craft. Tracer rounds cut through vacuum, visible only because of the phosphorescent coating that burned in hard radiation. I watched the stream track toward the target. The target broke left. My rounds passed through empty space. The target was gone. Something hit me from behind. Not weapons fire. Another craft. Collision. My fury tumbled. I fought the controls. Thrusters firing. Trying to arrest the spin. My vision rotated. Stars. Debris. Carrier hull. Stars. Debris. The gyroscopic stabilizers engaged. The spin slowed, stopped. I reoriented. My threat display showed 2 enemy craft on intercept vectors. I burned hard, pulling 7G. My vision grayed. I eased off. The enemies closed. I fired blind, spraying rounds across their probable approach path. I did not see if I hit anything. I was too busy trying not to die. The engagement lasted 53 seconds. When the enemy withdrew, we had lost 4 interceptors. Herrick survived. I saw his craft on my display, damaged, venting fuel, but maneuvering under control. We formed up and returned to the carrier. I climbed out of my cockpit and vomited on the hangar deck. No one reacted. 2 other pilots were doing the same. Herrick was not among them. He walked past me towards the debrief room. His flight suit was stained with sweat. His face was pale. He did not look at me. The debrief lasted 40 minutes. Marek reviewed gun camera footage from all surviving craft. He identified tactical errors, positioning failures, firing solutions abandoned prematurely, opportunities missed. He did not assign blame. He simply catalogued the failures and moved to the next clip. When he reached my footage, he paused at the moment I fired on the first target. He replayed it 3 times. Then he said, "You led the target based on its current vector. The pilot altered vector before your rounds arrived. You assumed predictable behavior. Assumption is fatal. Next time, fire where the enemy cannot go. Eliminate options." I logged this. We flew 46 combat engagements over the next 60 days. I survived all of them. Herrick survived all of them. 60% of our squadron did not. The replacements arrived in groups of 4 or 5, were assigned to the vacant craft, and died within days. I stopped learning their names. There was no purpose. They were designations. Fury 7-2, Fury 7-6, Fury 7-11. The pilots changed. The craft persisted. I achieved my first confirmed kill on engagement 17. Enemy bomber attempting to close on the carrier. I intercepted at 4,000 meters. Established lock. Fired sustained burst. 300 rounds. The bomber's fuselage split open. I saw the interior atmosphere vent in a crystalline cloud. The craft broke into sections. No ejection. The crew died inside. I logged the kill. The system updated my record. 1 confirmed. I felt nothing. By engagement 30, I had 11 confirmed kills. Herrick had 9. We flew together frequently, assigned to the same patrol patterns. We developed an unspoken coordination. When I maneuvered, he covered my vector. When he engaged, I provided suppression fire. We did not discuss this. It simply emerged from repetition. There was another pilot in our squadron who I began to notice during this period. Fury 7-12. The designation belonged to a pilot named Corvin. He had arrived in the same replacement group as 2 others who are now dead. He had survived 60 days. This was unusual. Most replacements died within 20. I began to pay attention to his performance during debriefs. He flew differently than the rest of us, more aggressively. He would close to knife fight range, sometimes within 100 meters, and fire point-blank bursts that rarely missed. This was tactically unsound. At that range, debris from a destroyed enemy could impact your craft, mission-killing damage even if you survived. Marek told him this repeatedly. Corvin acknowledged. He did not change. I spoke to him once in the ready room. I asked why he flew that way. He looked at me for a time before answering. Then he said, "If I am going to die, I want to see their cockpit when I kill them. I want to know I took someone with me." I did not understand the logic. I told him that seeing the enemy did not increase kill probability. He said, "I know, but it matters to me." I archived the conversation. On engagement 41, Herrick's craft suffered a critical malfunction. His starboard thruster array failed during a high-G evasive turn. The asymmetric thrust sent him into an uncontrolled tumble directly into a debris field. I watched it happen. I was 400 meters away, engaged with 2 enemy interceptors. I could not assist. I watched his craft impact a section of destroyed hull plating at 300 meters per second. The Fury crumpled. The reactor did not breach. Later analysis confirmed the emergency shutdown functioned correctly, but the cockpit section compressed by 40%. The recovery team extracted him 6 hours later. He was alive, unconscious. Both legs shattered. Spinal damage, internal hemorrhaging. They transferred him to the medical deck. I visited when my patrol rotation allowed. He was in a Medicaid bed, surrounded by monitoring equipment. His legs were encased in regeneration scaffolds. Tubes ran into his chest and arms, feeding him nutrients and flushing waste. His eyes were open. He tracked my movement as I entered. His voice was weak. He said, "I am being invalided out." I asked what that meant. He said, "Medical discharge. The spinal damage is too severe. Even with augmentation, I will not regain the reflex speed required for combat flight. They are transferring me to a logistics position. Planetary assignment. I will never fly again." I did not know what to say. I stood there and looked at him. He looked back. Then he said, "You will die in that cockpit, you know. All of you will. I am one of the lucky ones. I considered this. I said, perhaps. He closed his eyes. I left. They transferred him off the carrier 3 days later. I did not see him go. I was on patrol. When I returned, his bunk had been reassigned. Fury 7-9 had a new pilot. The replacement died on his second engagement. The one after that lasted 11 days. I stopped counting. Engagement 63 was different. We received deployment orders to support a contested orbital zone around a forge world I cannot recall the designation of. The enemy force was larger than standard raider strength. Fleet-level commitment, multiple capital ships, estimated fighter complement in the hundreds. Our battle group was one of 3 responding. The briefing lasted 7 minutes. Marek told us to expect sustained combat operations, multiple sorties per cycle, high casualty probability. He said ammunition would be rationed. He said we should make our rounds count. We launched in full wing strength, 72 interceptors, the largest deployment I had participated in. The flight to the engagement zone took 38 minutes. I used the time to review my ammunition count. 4,000 rounds, approximately 40 seconds of sustained fire at maximum rate. I had learned to fire in controlled bursts, 2-second triggers, 80 rounds per burst, 50 possible engagements if every burst connected. In reality, hit rates averaged 30%. I had ammunition for perhaps 15 effective engagements. After that, I would be a maneuvering target with no offensive capability. The engagement zone was unlike anything the simulations had prepared us for. The Forge world's orbital manufactories were burning. Debris fields extended for thousands of kilometers. Destroyed ships, civilian transports, cargo haulers, defense platforms, all tumbling in intersecting orbital paths. The enemy fleet held position at medium range, launching fighter waves in coordinated strikes against our capital ships. Our interceptors were tasked with screening. We were the barrier between their bombers and our carriers. The first enemy wave consisted of approximately 140 craft. Our 72 interceptors moved to intercept. The mathematics were unfavorable. I noted this. I engaged anyway. I killed 3 enemy fighters in the first 2 minutes. Close-range intercepts, textbook firing solutions, clean kills. My ammunition counter read 3,760 rounds remaining. The enemy kept coming. I maneuvered through a debris field, using wrecked hull sections as cover, emerging to fire then breaking line of sight before return fire could track me. This was effective for 6 additional kills. My counter read 3,040 rounds. Something fast crossed my sensor display. I barely registered it before the impact. Cannon rounds, heavy caliber, ripped through my port wing. Armor plating shredded. The wing structure held, but the maneuvering thrusters were destroyed. My craft immediately became asymmetric. Every turn pulled hard to starboard. I compensated, fired maneuvering jets in opposition, burned more fuel. I was now operating at reduced capability, with finite fuel reserves and no way to correct the imbalance. I continued fighting. The engagement lasted 4 hours and 17 minutes, not continuous. Waves. The enemy would strike, we would engage, they would withdraw. We would rearm and relaunch. I flew 3 separate sorties before my craft was too damaged to continue. By the time I returned to the carrier for final recovery, my ammunition was depleted. My fuel was at 11%. Half my maneuvering thrusters were offline, and I had logged 14 confirmed kills. I climbed out of the cockpit, and my legs failed. I collapsed on the hangar deck. A Medicaid team was present. They scanned me. Elevated heart rate, blood pressure dangerously high, severe dehydration, muscle tissue damage from sustained G-force exposure. They gave me an injection, something to stabilize my cardiovascular system. They told me to report to medical for full evaluation. I did not. I returned to my bunk. I slept for 14 hours. When I woke, the battle was over. We had held the orbital zone. The enemy had withdrawn. Casualty reports were still being compiled. I accessed the preliminary data. Of the 72 interceptors that had launched, 41 had returned. 31 total losses. 16 pilots recovered alive from disabled craft. 15 dead. No remains recovered from 9. They had been vaporized or lost in the debris fields. Corvin had survived. I saw him in the ready room. His flight suit was burned along the left arm. He had sustained injury when his cockpit had partially lost pressure. Flash freezing. The medikey had treated the tissue damage. He could still fly. He sat in the corner, alone, staring at nothing. I did not approach him. Marek did not conduct a standard debrief. There was too much gun camera footage. Too many engagements to analyze individually. He simply told us we had performed adequately. He said the replacement pilots would arrive within 3 days. He said we would redeploy to the next contested zone within the week. He dismissed us. I began to notice something during this period. A change in how I processed events. The first time I had killed an enemy pilot, I had felt nothing and noted this as unusual. Now I understood it was not unusual. It was adaptation. The human mind cannot sustain emotional response to repeated trauma. It archives the response, files it, continues operating. I was becoming more efficient. I also noticed I had stopped thinking about my life before training. The Schola Progenium, my parents, whose faces I could no longer clearly visualize. The white room, where I had taken the aptitude tests. These memories were degrading, not gone, simply less accessible. Like data on a damaged storage medium. I could recall that the memories existed. I could not always recall the content. The replacement pilots arrived. 12 of them. Young. They looked young, though some were perhaps only 2 or 3 standard years younger than I was. I was 21. I felt older. They attended their first briefing. Marek assigned them to the vacant craft. He told them the same things he had told me when I arrived. They were replacements. They would fly until they died or became unable to fly. There was no third option. I watched them during the briefing. One of them was taking notes, recording Marek's instructions in a small data slate. I wanted to tell him it would not matter. You could not study your way into survival. But I did not speak. He would learn or he would die learning. We redeployed to a new sector, more contested space. The enemy in this region was different, better coordinated. Their pilots flew with more discipline, tighter formations, more effective mutual support. Our casualty rates increased. Of the 12 replacements, 8 died within 10 days. The one who had been taking notes during the briefing lasted 6 days. His craft was destroyed by a long-range missile he never saw coming. The enemy had deployed ordnance we had not encountered in this sector before. Guided munitions. Fire and forget weapons that tracked thermal signatures. By the time we adapted our tactics, we had lost 11 interceptors. Corvin changed after this engagement. He stopped speaking during debriefs. He would sit and listen and nod when addressed, but he did not volunteer observations. In the cockpit, his performance became more erratic. He would break formation to pursue targets that other pilots had already engaged. He would expend excessive ammunition on already destroyed enemies, continuing to fire into debris fields long after the threat was neutralized. Marek noticed. He pulled Corvin from the flight rotation for 72 hours, mandatory rest. Psychological evaluation. I do not know what the evaluation concluded. Corvin returned to flight status. He seemed unchanged. We launched on a long-range patrol, 8 interceptors, tasked with reconnaissance of an enemy staging area. The flight required 4 hours at sustained cruise speed. No combat expected. Pure intelligence gathering. We encountered an enemy patrol 30 minutes from the target zone. 6 enemy craft. We had numerical advantage. We engaged. Standard intercept pattern. I achieved lock on the rearmost enemy fighter and fired. Clean kill. I was maneuvering to engage a second target when I saw Corvin break formation. He accelerated directly toward the enemy formation center at maximum burn. Alone. No support. Marek's voice came across the command channel. Fury, 712. Return to formation. Acknowledge. Corvin did not acknowledge. He closed to point-blank range with the nearest enemy craft and fired a sustained burst. The enemy exploded. Corvin flew through the debris cloud. His craft emerged damaged, trailing fuel vapor, but still maneuvering. He immediately engaged a second target. Same tactic. Suicidal close approach. He killed the target but took multiple hits in the process. I watched his craft. It was dying. Reactor temperature climbing. Fuel leak expanding. Hull integrity compromised. He had perhaps 60 seconds before catastrophic failure. He used those seconds to engage a third target. He achieved the kill. His reactor breached immediately after. The explosion was small. No secondary detonation. The fuel had already vented. Just the reactor core failing and releasing its containment energy in a brief, bright flash. Then nothing. The debris tumbled away, scattering across orbital vectors that would carry the pieces for centuries. We destroyed the remaining enemy craft and continued the patrol. Marek logged Corvin's death as killed in action. 3 confirmed kills in final engagement. Total service record 47 confirmed kills across 93 combat sorties. The report was filed. We returned to the carrier. I did not attend the ceremony. There was no ceremony. Corvin had no recoverable remains. He simply ceased to exist in the tactical database as an active pilot and was archived as a casualty statistic. His replacement arrived 2 days later. I did not learn the replacement's name. He died on his first combat deployment when his craft suffered a cockpit seal failure during a high-G maneuver, decompression. He was dead before he could activate emergency protocols. I stopped trying to remember names. By engagement 112, I had 39 confirmed kills. I had survived 8 months of continuous combat operations. This was statistically unusual. Average survival time for interceptor pilots in our battle group was 47 days. I had exceeded this by a factor of 5. I did not know why. Skill was a component. Luck was a larger component. I had survived engagements that should have killed me through circumstances I could not control. Enemy rounds that missed by centimeters. Reactor malfunctions that occurred in enemies instead of my craft. Debris fields that I navigated successfully, while other pilots impacted fatal obstacles. I began to wonder if survival was desirable. This thought emerged during a rest period. I was lying in my bunk, unable to sleep despite exhaustion. My body was present. My mind continued flying. Phantom sensations. I could feel G-forces that were not occurring. I could see threat indicators that were not active. My hands moved involuntarily, reaching for controls that were not present. The other pilots in the bunk room were sleeping. I could hear their breathing, irregular, broken by occasional sounds. One pilot was whispering something in his sleep. I could not make out the words. I considered what Harrick had said, that he was lucky to be invalided out, that I would die in the cockpit. The statement had probability on its side. Every engagement I survived simply increased the likelihood that the next engagement would be fatal. The statistics were clear. Pilots died. The only variable was when. I found this thought neither comforting nor distressing. It simply was. We deployed to another sector. The pattern continued. Launch. Engage. Kill or be killed. Return. Rearm. Launch again. The enemy changed. Different ship classes, different fighter designs, different tactical doctrines. The core experience remained identical. Cramped cockpit, crushing G-forces, target acquisition, firing solution, trigger pull, confirm kill, maneuver, repeat. I stopped experiencing fear. This was not bravery. It was depletion. The physiological fear response requires neurochemical resources. Adrenaline, cortisol, other compounds I do not know the names of. The body produces these in response to perceived threat. Sustained exposure to continuous threat depletes the production capacity. The response fades. You continue to register danger intellectually, but the physical reaction ceases. I could see an enemy fighter on intercept vector, know that I might die in the next 30 seconds, and feel nothing. My heart rate remained steady. My hands did not shake. I simply executed the required procedures. Maneuver, acquire, fire, assess. The process became automatic. During engagement 147, I experienced something I had not encountered before. My craft suffered a direct hit to the cockpit section. Not a penetrating hit, the armor held, but the impact was severe enough to shatter the canopy's inner reinforcement layer. Cracks spiderwebbed across my entire field of vision. I could still see, but the display was fractured. Every direction I looked, the stars were broken into geometric patterns. I continued fighting. I had no choice. Ejection in the middle of an active engagement zone meant death. Staying in a compromised craft also meant death, but it meant death while still capable of killing enemies. I chose the latter. I flew for 43 minutes with the shattered canopy. I killed 2 enemy craft during this period. My firing solutions were less accurate. The fractured canopy made target tracking more difficult, but functional. When the engagement concluded and we returned to the carrier, the maintenance crews examined my craft and declared it mission incapable pending full canopy replacement. I was reassigned to a different Fury, while mine was being repaired. Fury 718. The previous pilot had died 4 hours earlier. The cockpit still smelled like burned meat. Something had gotten through the armor. Fire, perhaps, or superheated gas from a plasma weapon. The pilot had cooked. The body had been removed. The blood had been cleaned. The smell persisted. I flew Fury 718 for 6 days while my primary craft was being repaired. I killed 9 enemies during this period. The craft handled differently than 7-4. The control response was slower. The reactor output was lower. The weapons targeting system had a drift that required constant manual correction. I adapted. I logged the differences. I continued flying. When 7-4 was repaired, I transferred back. The new canopy was clear, undamaged. I could see perfectly. I found this disorienting for the first several minutes of flight. I had adapted to the fractured view. The clarity seemed wrong. I recalibrated my expectations and continued. Marek was killed during engagement 162. His craft took multiple hits during a close-range furball. The cockpit section was destroyed. No ejection. He had been flying for 19 years. 273 confirmed kills. 4 major campaigns. Multiple commendations I never saw the details of. His death was logged as killed in action. Cause of death, catastrophic structural failure. No remains recovered. The replacement squadron commander arrived within 2 days. Flight Captain Orion, younger than Marek. 13 years service. 141 confirmed kills. No visible injuries. He conducted his first briefing with efficiency. He reviewed our current tactical performance. identified deficiencies, and implemented new patrol patterns. He spoke with a clipped, rapid cadence, every word precise. No wasted breath. He flew with us on his third day aboard. Personal assessment of squadron capability, he said. He wanted to observe our performance directly. We launched on standard patrol. No contact expected. We encountered an enemy ambush 30 minutes into the flight. 8 enemy craft concealed in a debris field, waiting. They hit us before we could react. 2 of our interceptors were destroyed in the opening salvo. Orien's voice came across the command channel. Calm. No stress indicators. He issued tactical instructions. Specific vectors, specific targets, specific firing solutions. We executed. The engagement lasted 90 seconds. We destroyed all 8 enemy craft. We lost 2 additional interceptors in the process. 4 total losses. 8 enemies dead. Orien logged this as acceptable exchange ratio. I began to understand that Orien processed combat differently than Marek had. Marek had flown as if trying to minimize casualties. Orien flew as if casualties were simply another tactical resource to be expended for mission success. Neither approach was wrong. Both were functional. I noted the difference and adapted my expectations. The war continued. I stopped tracking which sector we were fighting in. They all looked the same. Debris fields, enemy craft, engagement, death. The specifics varied. The pattern did not. I achieved my 100th confirmed kill during engagement 203. The system logged it automatically. A notification appeared on my tactical display. Sentry marker achieved. Record updated. I felt nothing. The enemy I had killed was just another target. The number was just another piece of data. I continued the engagement. After I landed, Orien pulled me aside. He said achieving 100 kills was statistically rare. He said fewer than 8% of interceptor pilots survived long enough to reach that threshold. He said I should take pride in the accomplishment. I told him I did not feel pride. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "Good. Pride gets pilots killed." He walked away. I began to notice during this period that I could not remember what I looked like. There were no mirrors in the pilot quarters, no reflective surfaces except the occasional polished metal panel. I had not seen my own face in months. I knew I had lost weight. The flight suit fit more loosely than it had when I first received it. I knew I had sustained injuries, small ones. Burns, cuts, bruising from the restraint harness during high-G maneuvers. But I could not visualize my own face. I tried to recall it. The effort was similar to trying to remember my mother's face. The data was corrupted, inaccessible. I mentioned this to one of the other pilots during the rest period. He said he had experienced the same thing. He said he sometimes wondered if he still existed outside the cockpit or if the person walking around the carrier was just a maintenance interval between flights. I understood what he meant. That pilot died 3 days later. Reactor malfunction. He had no time to eject. I attended no ceremony because there was none. His bunk was reassigned. We deployed to a long-duration campaign. 6 weeks of continuous operations in a heavily contested zone. Multiple enemy fleets. Constant engagement. We flew 4 sorties per day. Sleep periods were reduced to 4 hours per cycle. Meals were nutrient paste consumed in the cockpit between flights. The maintenance crews worked continuously, repairing damage as fast as we inflicted it on ourselves through combat stress. I lost track of time. Days blurred into identical segments. Launch, fight, land, rearm. Launch. The cycle repeated until it became the only thing that existed. I stopped thinking about anything beyond the next engagement. Planning for the future seemed absurd when the future was measured in hours. We lost 40% of the squadron during those 6 weeks. The replacements arrived in groups and died in groups. I stopped seeing them as individuals. They were simply designations. New entries in the tactical database that would be archived as casualties before their names had fully registered in my memory. One of the replacements lasted longer than expected. 3 weeks. Long enough that I noticed him. His designation was Fury 721. I never learned his name. He flew competently, not exceptional, simply adequate. He followed orders, maintained formation discipline, achieved reasonable hit rates. He survived by being unremarkable. During one engagement, his craft was disabled, engine damage, no maneuvering capability. He was drifting, a stationary target. An enemy fighter moved to finish him. I was engaged with a different target. I made a choice. I broke off my engagement and intercepted the enemy moving toward 21. I achieved kill. 21 survived. After we landed, he approached me. He said I had saved his life. He said he was in my debt. I told him there was no debt. I had made a tactical decision. Preserving functional pilots was operationally sound. He looked confused. He said something else, but I was already walking away. He died 2 days later. Different engagement. I was not in position to assist. He took a missile hit to the cockpit. Direct impact. The explosion was immediate. Total structural failure. I watched it happen on my tactical display. I felt nothing. I continued to 300 combat sorties, then 400. My kill count reached 137. I had been flying combat operations for 1 year and 4 months. I was 22 standard years old. I could not remember what being 21 had felt like. I could not remember what feeling felt like. Orion called me to his office. This was unusual. Individual pilot meetings were rare. I entered. He gestured for me to sit. I sat. He looked at me across his desk. He said, "You have been flying longer than anyone else currently in the squadron. You have more combat experience than 3/4 of the pilots on this carrier. I am promoting you to flight leader. You will command a 4-ship element. Acknowledged?" I acknowledged. He said, "You will also begin training replacement pilots, personal instruction, one-on-one flight time with new arrivals. Your experience will improve their survival probability." I considered this. I said, "Training does not significantly impact survival rates. The variables that determine pilot mortality are primarily circumstantial. Enemy capability, engagement geometry, mechanical reliability. Individual skill contributes less than 15% to survival outcomes." Orion stared at me. He said, "Train them anyway. Dismissed." I trained them. The first replacement I was assigned to instruct arrived 3 days later. He was young, 17, perhaps 18. He had graduated from training 6 weeks prior. This was his first operational posting. He was excited. He told me he had wanted to be a fighter pilot since childhood. He said it was an honor to serve. He asked me what combat was like. I did not know how to answer that question. I said, cramped, loud, brief. He waited for me to elaborate. I did not. He asked specific questions. I answered them. How do you track multiple targets simultaneously? You do not. You prioritize and engage sequentially. How do you compensate for high-G blackout? You do not. You avoid maneuvers that exceed your physiological threshold. How do you stay calm during combat? You do not stay calm. You simply continue functioning regardless of your physiological state. He looked uncertain. He asked if I had any advice. I said, do not expect to survive. Expectation creates hesitation. Hesitation is fatal. Perform your function until you cannot." He did not respond. We flew a training sortie. No combat, simple maneuvering drills. He performed adequately. His technique was sound. His reaction time was acceptable. He would probably die within 2 weeks. He died in 9 days. Enemy ambush. He was the first pilot hit. His craft was destroyed before he could maneuver. I was present. I could not assist. I logged his death and continued the engagement. The second replacement I trained lasted 4 days. The third lasted 6 hours. She launched on her first combat sortie and was killed by friendly fire. One of our own interceptors mistook her for an enemy during a confused close-range engagement. The rounds that killed her were fired by another pilot I had trained. He did not know until the debrief when we reviewed gun camera footage. He saw the Imperial Navy markings on the craft he had destroyed. He stopped speaking. He simply stood and walked out of the briefing room. He killed himself 3 hours later, walked out an airlock without a suit, decompression. He was dead before anyone could stop him. I attended no ceremony. I simply continued. I trained 16 replacement pilots over the next 4 months. 14 of them died. One was invalided out after a crash landing shattered his spine. One survived long enough to be transferred to a different squadron when our unit was reorganized. I stopped attempting to improve their survival probability. I simply walked them through the procedures, flew the required training hours, and logged them as combat ready. They died, or they did not. My involvement changed nothing. I reached 500 combat sorties. My kill count was 173. I had been flying for 1 year and 9 months. I was older than almost every pilot on the carrier. Not chronologically, most of them had more standard years than I did. But I had more flight hours, more engagements, more kills, more survival. I was becoming something the others were not. I did not know what to call it. Veteran seemed insufficient. I was not wiser. I was not more skilled. I had simply continued existing when probability suggested I should not have. During a rest period, I was lying in my bunk and I realized I could not remember my parents' names. I knew I had parents. The record confirmed this. They had died in naval service. I had been conscripted from the Schola Progenium as a result, but their names were gone. The files were corrupted. I tried to recall. I spent 30 minutes attempting to access the memory. Nothing. Just empty space where the data should have been. I stopped trying. We redeployed to a new campaign. Fleet-level engagement. Largest deployment I had participated in. 3 battle groups. Combined interceptor strength of over 400 craft. The enemy force was comparable. The briefings estimated engagement duration at 2 to 3 weeks. Continuous operations. High casualty probability. Replacement pilots were pre-positioned on support ships, ready to fill losses as they occurred. The first week, we lost 60 interceptors. The second week, 90. By the third week, the replacement pipeline was exhausted. We were flying with half-strength squadrons. Damaged craft that should have been mission incapable were being pushed back into service because there were no alternatives. I flew with cracked canopy for 4 days. Failed reactor coolant systems for 2 days. Jammed landing gear for an entire week. I simply stayed in the cockpit between sorties because landing and relaunching was impossible. They refueled me in the cockpit, fed me nutrient paste through a tube. I slept strapped into the seat. When the engagement finally concluded and I could land properly, my legs had atrophied from lack of use. I could not walk. The Medicaid team carried me to the medical bay. I recovered. I always recovered. I returned to flight status 6 days later. My kill count reached 200. The system logged it. No notification this time, just an updated number in the database. 200 confirmed kills. I had destroyed 200 enemy craft, perhaps more. The confirmed count only included kills with verified gun camera footage. Probable kills, where the target was destroyed but attribution was unclear, were not counted. I had perhaps 30 or 40 additional probables. I had killed hundreds of people. Pilots like me, strapped into cramped cockpits, flying until they died. I had ended their continuation. I felt nothing about this. They were targets. I was the weapon. The system functioned as designed. Orion was killed during engagement 643. Enemy bomber Suicide Run rammed his craft directly. Both craft were destroyed. No survivors. He had been squadron commander for 11 months. He was replaced within 3 days by another flight captain, whose name I did not retain. The war continued. I began to experience something during this period. Isolation. Not physical. I was surrounded by other pilots constantly. Briefings, patrols, the ready room, the bunk quarters. But I could not connect to them. They spoke about things I no longer understood. Some of them discussed families, homes they planned to return to, lives they would resume when their service tours concluded. These concepts had no meaning to me. I had no home. I had no life outside the cockpit. The idea of service concluding seemed impossible. Service ended when you died. That was the only conclusion. One pilot asked me during a rest period how I had survived so long. I told him I did not know. He asked if I had advice. I said no. He waited for more. I had nothing more to give him. He walked away. That pilot died the next day. I reached engagement 700. 700 separate combat operations. The number was absurd, statistically impossible. I should have died hundreds of engagements ago. But I continued. The craft continued to function. The enemy continued to die. I continued to return. I began to wonder if I was still human. The question emerged during a prolonged isolation period. My craft had been damaged during an engagement. I ejected successfully, first time I had ever needed to eject, and was recovered by a search team. But the recovery took 18 hours. 18 hours in a sealed ejection pod, drifting in vacuum, waiting. The pod was barely larger than a coffin. I could not move, could not see outside. The life support was minimal. Recycled air, temperature regulation, water supply, nothing else. Just existence. I spent 18 hours alone with my thoughts. I tried to access memories. Childhood, training. My first kill. Herrick, Corvin. The faces of pilots I had flown with. Nothing came clearly. Just fragments. Corrupted data. I existed in the present moment. The past was deteriorating. The future did not exist. Only now. Only this pod. Only breathing and waiting. When they recovered me, the first thing I asked was when I could return to flight status. The recovery team looked at me strangely. One of them said I should probably rest. I said I did not require rest. I required flight assignment. I was returned to the carrier, evaluated by the medical staff, cleared for flight. I was back in a cockpit within 30 hours of my ejection. I began to understand what Herrick had meant. I would die in the cockpit, not because I was unlucky, but because I had become unable to exist anywhere else. The cockpit was the only space that still made sense. The controls, the displays, the compression of the restraint harness, the smell of recycled air and machine oil, and my own sweat. This was home. This was the only place I still functioned properly. Outside the cockpit, I was partial, incomplete, a component removed from its system. Inside, I was whole. I flew engagement 800, then 900. My kill count reached 237. I had been flying for 2 years and 3 months. I was 23 standard years old. I was the longest-serving combat pilot on the carrier. Other pilots looked at me the way I had once looked at Marek, as something unusual, something that had survived when it should not have. New pilots asked me questions. I answered when required. Mostly, they just watched, observing, trying to understand what made me different. I was not different. I was simply still here. That was all. We deployed to another campaign. More combat, more death. The pattern never changed. I stopped experiencing surprise at anything. Enemy ambushes, mechanical failures, friendly casualties, tactical victories, strategic defeats. All equally expected, all equally irrelevant. I flew, I killed, I returned. The cycle continued. During engagement 972, something happened that I still cannot fully explain. I was engaged with an enemy fighter in a debris field. Standard intercept. I achieved firing position. I had clear line of sight. Perfect solution. I pulled the trigger. Nothing happened. The cannon was jammed. Mechanical failure. I was in a high-threat environment with no offensive capability. Standard procedure, disengage, return to carrier, rearm. I did not disengage. I continued pursuing the target. I do not know why. Some fragment of instinct or thought process I cannot access. I closed range. The enemy was maneuvering, trying to shake me. I matched every turn. Closer. 100 meters. 50. 20. I rammed him. My craft's nose section impacted his port wing at combined closure rate of 800 meters per second. Both craft were heavily damaged. His wing tore free. He went into an uncontrolled spin. My forward sensors were destroyed. My canopy was cracked. Reactor warnings screamed across my display. I fought the controls. Arrested the tumble. Stabilized. The enemy did not. I watched him spin into a section of destroyed hull and explode. I returned to the carrier on emergency power. When I landed, the maintenance crews swarmed my craft. They examined the damage. The chief maintenance officer looked at me and said, "What happened?" I said, "Cannon malfunction." I improvised. He stared at me. He said, "You rammed an enemy fighter." I said, "Yes." He did not respond. He simply shook his head and walked away. The current squadron commander called me to his office. He asked me to explain the engagement. I explained. He asked why I had not disengaged when my weapon system failed. I said I had not considered it. He asked what I had been thinking. I said I had not been thinking. I had simply acted. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "You are being rotated out of combat operations." I did not understand. I asked why. He said, "You have exceeded maximum recommended flight hours. 2 years continuous combat. No pilot is supposed to fly that long without rotation to non-combat duties. You should have been pulled months ago, but there were no replacements available. There are now. You are being reassigned to training command, effective immediately." I said, "I do not want reassignment. I want to continue flying combat operations." He said, "That is not your decision. You are being transferred." Acknowledged? I acknowledged. I flew my final combat sortie 3 days later, routine patrol. No contact. I launched, flew the pattern, and returned. The entire flight lasted 93 minutes. When I landed, I climbed out of the cockpit and stood on the hangar deck and looked at my craft. Fury 7-4. I had flown it for 2 years, 997 combat sorties, 241 confirmed kills, countless near-death experiences. I would never fly it again. I was transferred to a training facility, different ship, different sector. My new assignment was instructor pilot. I would train new candidates, teach them what I knew, improve their survival probability. I trained them. I walked them through the procedures. I flew with them. I observed their mistakes and corrected them. Some listened, some did not. It made no difference. They would die or they would not. I had learned this. I have been in this role for 4 months now. I train approximately 20 new pilots per month. I do not learn their names. I call them by their designated call signs. They call me instructor. I do not correct this. I sleep 4 hours per night, sometimes less. I experience dreams. Always the same. I am in the cockpit. The engagement is happening. Targets everywhere. I am firing, maneuvering, trying to survive. I wake with my heart racing, my hands reaching for controls that are not there. The dream feels more real than my current existence. I requested return to combat operations twice. Both requests were denied. I was told I had exceeded lifetime flight hour recommendations. I was told continued combat flight would pose unacceptable psychological risk. I was told my experience was more valuable in training new pilots. I was told many things. None of them changed my situation. I exist now in a strange state. I am alive. I am functional. I perform my assigned duties adequately. But I do not feel present. I feel like a recording of a person who used to exist, playing back behaviors, responses, interactions. The actual person is gone. What remains is the pattern. Sometimes I think about the pilots I trained, the ones who died, 16 of them. I remember that number, but I cannot remember their faces. I remember Harrick's face, though the details are fading. I remember Corvin, though I am not certain I could describe him accurately anymore. I remember Marek's voice, the mechanical rasp from his damaged throat. I remember the cockpit of Fury 7-4 more clearly than I remember any person. I wonder if this is what the Imperium requires. Not soldiers who believe. Not warriors who fight for ideals. Just components. Functional pieces that perform their designated role until they cannot. I performed mine. I flew 997 combat missions. I killed 241 enemy combatants. I survived when I should not have. I became something that was no longer fully human. Just a weapon with awareness. A targeting system with memory. And now I train the next generation. I show them how to sit in the cramped cockpit, how to manage the G-forces, how to fire the autocannons, how to kill efficiently. I do not tell them what it costs. They will learn that themselves, or they will die before they understand. Either way, my telling them would change nothing. The Imperium requires pilots. It processes children into candidates, candidates into pilots, and pilots into casualties. The system consumes. It has consumed me. I am still breathing, still functional, but the person I was no longer exists. That person died somewhere between Engagement 1 and Engagement 997. I do not know exactly when. I did not notice the transition. I simply continued flying until there was nothing left except the flight. Sometimes, in the quiet moments between training sessions, I close my eyes and I can feel it. The compression of the restraint harness, the vibration through the hull when the autocannon fires, the way your vision tunnels during high G turns. The particular quality of light and vacuum when you are alone in the debris field and everything is silent except your own breathing inside the helmet. I miss it. I know that is wrong. I know. I should be grateful to be alive, to be safe, to be removed from the endless cycle of combat and death. But I am not grateful. I am simply here, continuing, processing, training the next group who will sit in those cockpits and die in those debris fields. The machine consumes. I was consumed. Now I feed it. That is what remains.